is the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The Holocaust for many of us is particularly poignant, and it is very appropriate that we have Dr. Panush deliver grand rounds today. I don't want to give a lengthy introduction because I want to spend most of the time listening to Dr. Panush because he has a lot to say. Let me just simply say that Dr. Panush has been a professor of medicine in many institutions, including our own institution now for the past many years. But what makes Dr. Panush so unique is I think I can very candidly, honestly, and forthrightly say that I don't think I've ever met an individual with a degree of compassion, sense of human dignity, all in a very understated way as Dr. Panush. Those of us who went to medical school, we learned science, you can memorize biochemistry pathways. What is much more difficult is to appreciate that we all are humans, and as humans, we all are afforded and should be afforded a certain degree of respect, honor, and dignity. Quite tragically, hate is nothing new in the world. It's most recently reared its head with the anti-Asian vitriol. Right now we're going through a trial in Minnesota of an individual who was allegedly killed a black man, probably for the only reason that he is black. So whether you are a bigot in the flavor of anti-black, anti-white, anti-Asian, anti-Semitic, anti-Latino, anti-Muslim, it doesn't matter. It's all bad. And there's no one, I think, better prepared, better placed, and better informed than Dr. Panush to help us guide through some of the atrocities that have happened in the past, and by extension, therefore, learn from them and be able to move forward and assume our responsibility as physicians in being the shining light, in being the guiding light, and in hopefully leading all of us to a more understanding world as we go forward. So I apologize for babbling. Dr. Panush, please take it away.
Wow. Thank you, Billy, for the most kind introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to present grand rounds today. International Holocaust Remembrance Day is indeed an auspicious time to examine aspects of medicine under the Nazis for the instructive perspectives about inequities in healthcare and our responsibilities as physicians for injustice. The message is, I think, simple and clear. Silence, professional or personal, in the face of injustice is wrong. I shall begin by doing something that used to be an integral part of most medical grand rounds, presenting the patient. In fact, I'll briefly present two patients to illustrate the entities I'll be talking about later and to include at least some clinical material in today's discussion. This is a lady I cared for many years ago. When I first saw her, she was 56 with a long history of back pain, may have had an episode of urethritis, did have iritis, chest wall discomfort, and a painful swollen forefoot for a number of months. Her physicians hadn't offered her a certain diagnosis, and the treatments they had provided had not been satisfactory. When seen, she had sacroiliitis, costochondritis, asymmetrical inflammatory oligoarthritis, no GI or skin abnormalities. She was HLA-B27 positive, rheumatoid factor and ANA negative, and had a highly elevated sedimentation rate. While not entirely classic, because of the possible urethritis and prominent asymmetrical oligoarthritis, this probably best fit what we then called Reiter's syndrome, or perhaps incomplete Reiter's, a term we use for patients not exhibiting all the classic GI, GU, eye, skin, and articular features. The patient responded very nicely to regular NSAIDs, sulfasalazine, and methotrexate. It's relatively recently, historically, that the seronegative spondyloarthritides were recognized as different from rheumatoid arthritis, clinically, serologically, radiographically, and immunologically. They include the disorders listed here, among which is Reiter's syndrome, now termed reactive arthritis. Common shared clinical features are shown and illustrated here, many of which the patient displayed, highlighted. I won't read them to you, but note the photos clockwise of characteristic sausage fidgets, phenylcercinate balanitis, iritis, keratodermia bonorrhagica, sacroiliitis, and spondylitis with the bamboo spine appearance. Depending on preponderant symptoms, we usually manage these patients as we would for ordinary ankylosing spondylitis or rheumatoid arthritis, sometimes psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis. This was a patient I saw very early in my career as a young faculty member at the University of Florida, a middle-aged male in prior good health who developed fevers, malaise, weight loss, sinusitis, breathlessness, hemoptysis, dark urine, something on the skin, and arthritis. When seen, he had sinus tenderness, palpable purpura, galls and rhonchi, and inflammatory synovitis. After documenting a mild anemia, schistocytes on the peripheral smear, and red cell casts in the urine, pulmonary infiltrates on chest X-ray, and obtaining skin and renal biopsies, we initiated pulse dose IV solumedrol and IV cyclophosphamide for a classic example of what was then called Whiting's granulomatosis. The patient stabilized and did well and stayed well. Before then, he would have been treated only with corticosteroids and likely died within a couple of years. As you see here, literally from the textbook, our patient exhibited the classic manifestations of what we now call granulomatosis with polyangiitis, GPA. Anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibodies have been identified and associated with the vasculitides some years after we cared for this patient, and in GPA are typically with cytoplasmic staining into proteinase 3. And I'm sure you appreciate the emergence of rituximab as an important therapeutic alternative to cyclophosphamide for many of these patients. He was among the first patients at Florida with systemic necrotizing vasculitis whom we treated with cyclophosphamide. How that came to be used here is interesting in several respects, and worth, I think, a moment of modern medical history, which I had an opportunity to observe. We did this after hearing presentations and reading about this new approach to these disorders by a bright young investigator at the NIH, Anthony Fauci, and his collaborators, Paul Katz and Bart Haynes, shown here with some of their classic publications. We then actually used to occasionally send them patients for their trials, and sometimes we talked with Dr. Fauci and his colleagues by phone to discuss mutual patients or ask advice. It's notable that Anthony Fauci did rheumatology early in his career. He is, in fact, the master of our American College of Rheumatology. I also marked the name of Paul Katz here, as it was through Paul that I first met Dr. Fauci. At the time, this was really not different in meeting other very respected colleagues known only by reputation or through phone conversations or correspondence. It happened because Paul, a graduate of Georgetown, came to Florida for his medical residency, where he was outstanding, while I was the division chief there. Paul was interested in rheumatology, and we were pleased for him when he decided to do his fellowship at the NIH, where he had an important role in vasculitis studies, after which he came back to Gainesville and joined our faculty. One of the first visiting professors we then had was Paul's mentor, Dr. Fauci, a visit which included the three of us going on a run around campus to a nature preserve because Tony, born in Brooklyn, wanted to see a real live Florida alligator. Paul's co-fellow, Bart Haynes, returned to Duke to later be division chief and department chair. Paul eventually returned home to Georgetown as division chief, then Department of Medicine chair, later the founding dean of the new Cooper Medical School at Rowan in New Jersey, and now a university president. And Tony became the iconic Dr. Fauci. Today, I'd like to briefly highlight selected literature about injustice and inequities in the healthcare of patients with rheumatic disease, relate preliminary observations from our own patients at LAC, consider how we might reduce at least some of these inequities, then convey my own experiences, often quite personal, about identifying and trying to address certain injustices relating to the Holocaust, Nazi medicine, physicians, and FNMs, as these help frame my thinking about our responsibilities as physicians for social injustice. Let's contemplate for a moment some of the happenings of last year. I, probably like you, was profoundly moved by many of the events and social protests that occurred last summer and through much of the past year. And they continue, and they've grown. I've never been politically active or a member of any party, never considered myself a social activist. If somebody told me earlier in my career that someday I would be talking about this, I would have been incredulous. However, my perspective about this has changed. I came to view this as heightening our awareness of particular human predicaments, evoking echoes of other societal and historical injustices, something we should not ignore, something that challenges us not only as individuals, but also as physicians, something that merits our attention and consideration. Justice for all is promised in our Pledge of Allegiance, justice in the Constitution, equality in the Declaration of Independence, and the fundamental right to health care is asserted in the Constitution of the WHO. Descartes proclaimed that the preservation of health is without a doubt the first good and the foundation of all other goods of this life. The reality, however, as expressed by many in various words and phrases, is quite different for too many throughout the world, and yes, even in these United States. This has now been widely recognized and much in the news and media, including our own, here in the Rheumatologist, one of our publications. The American College of Physicians, the American College of Rheumatology, the USC also, not shown here, and others have issued formal statements condemning discrimination, inequities, racism, bias, harassment, and injustice, and advocating transformative change. So I think it's important that we set aside at least part of an hour to reflect on some of this together. Whatever else one might consider as present-day social injustices, we likely could agree that there are inequities in healthcare. Let's begin with some of the recent and current attention in prominent journals to healthcare injustice generally, and then in patients with rheumatic diseases more specifically. Obviously, I'm more familiar with the rheumatic disease than the general literature, and I suspect the issues identified in our patients are not unique to them. We see this now widely here in The Lancet, in our official journal, Arthritis and Rheumatology, another of our journals, Nature Reviews Rheumatology, for some time now in Arthritis Care and Research, and an article of which I recently became aware in preparation on an important topic, the adverse effects of the pandemic on the routine care of our patients. I'll summarize salient aspects of these in citations on the next couple of slides momentarily. This two-volume series in rheumatic disease clinics addressed this comprehensively and is a nice example of current interest in thinking. Lupus has probably been studied best of our diseases. At one of our clinical conferences last August, we heard a lovely exposition of this by one of the leading investigators in this field, Panush from UCSF, who's elegantly documented the inequities in the care received by underprivileged lupus patients, as have others, including Kimberly DeQuattro, who was a USC student and MedPeds resident here before her recent MedPeds Rheumatology Fellowship at UCSF. Rheumatoid arthritis, represented here, and other rheumatic diseases haven't been studied quite as well as lupus, but the data are similar. Patients who are less privileged, under or uninsured, poor, and lower socioeconomic classes, or with less access to rheumatologists, as in this article in Press about rural and remote patients, fare less well and have poorer outcomes. Here is summarized available information about causes of healthcare inequities and disparities in patients with rheumatic diseases. Institute of Medicine definitions notwithstanding, these include race, ethnicity, gender and sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, access, availability and quality of health insurance, patient and physician treatment preferences, bias, discrimination and stereotyping, workforce diversity, variations in disease prevalence and severity, disabilities, and immigrant status. The consequences are that these patients are seen later in the course of disease, have fewer rheumatologic visits, have fewer and later use of disease-modifying and biologic therapies, less frequent and later surgical interventions, worse disease activity and control, poorer outcomes, suffer adverse effects on income, social and interpersonal interactions and self-esteem, have more disability, and they experience poor physical health, mental health, and quality of life. These observations for patients with rheumatic diseases likely generalized to other specialties. Sadly, our homeless patients with RA at County exemplified most of this too well. Rich Cito, now a rheumatology fellow at UCLA, started this work as a resident with us a couple of years ago, finding that these patients tended to be African American males who missed appointments, were seen frequently in the ER, were not on as much rheumatic medication and on more steroids than non-homeless patients and had severe disease, none of which was really surprising. 3 of these patients subsequently obtained secure housing, after which they improved considerably, probably reflecting better ability to receive care. I'd like to offer a few thoughts about trying to reduce inequitable care for these patients. Unfortunately, until and unless our society makes the collective judgment that the injustice of inequitable health care is intolerable and commits the resources to correct this, which, despite my political naivete, I don't see happening in today's America, my guess is that change will likely be incremental and modest. However, I believe we shouldn't accept injustice simply because change is difficult. We shouldn't be silent, and we should still advocate for what we think is right while doing the best we can for our patients. I will return to these thoughts towards the end of my presentation. I don't claim expertise here and don't presume to have the answers. However, I learned from the literature addressing how to reach and approach patients with early RA, from my co-authors when editorializing about this and from my collaborators here, and think I now know some of the important questions. In our paper about the homeless, we started to list here what we thought were important issues, together with aspirational and practical recommendations, suggesting possible approaches as have others. It seemed to me that we need to rethink at least some aspects of how we care for our patients, certainly those who are not treated equitably. We do well with those who come to us, who are able to obtain the medications and services we prescribe, and who then return for follow-up care. But around the world, and even here, that model doesn't work for all, and misses many, likely large numbers of patients. We need new and better and more imaginative ways to reach them, some of which perhaps could be developed and implemented without enormous cost or social transformation. I think some of the key questions here are: what is minimally adequate or acceptable rheumatologic or perhaps other subspecialty care? How is it defined and quantified? And how can we conceive more innovative ways to deliver it towards equivalent? Does it always require a rheumatologist or specialist? How much and how often? What could substitute for a rheumatologist or a visit with one? When could PCPs do this? Train non-physicians? What could better telehealth offer? Algorithms, protocols, digital health, artificial intelligence, combinations of these, and if so, which? What recommendations and guidelines are appropriate for patients who can't afford certain anti-rheumatic therapies, for those who haven't access to us or can't come to our offices? Our current guidelines, of which we have many, don't consider this at all. How about an equivalent to street medicine, not necessarily always physicians, for some of these patients? Who's going to invent the infrared or other technology-based app to measure joint inflammation or other outcomes and figure out how to transmit data remotely? How do we communicate effectively with the patients who can't come to the clinic or the office? What would be the role for personalized or predictive care in the future to identify patients likely to respond or not to particular therapies and circumstances? I would imagine that some of this is relevant beyond just rheumatology. I wish now to consider physician responsibility for social injustice today, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, not only in the context of contemporary events and issues like healthcare inequities, but also from the perspective of certain aspects of the Holocaust, particularly the role of physicians. This is always an emotionally difficult topic for me to talk about. Each time I prepare and present this, it's very hard. I consider myself a vicarious Holocaust survivor, but for the fortuitous accident of my birth in Detroit during World War II, rather than in one of my parents' villages in Poland, I too would have been a victim, like those in my family who were unable to flee Eastern Europe for the war. I identify strongly with them, and I'm not dispassionate. International Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, is observed as a day of commemoration for the approximately 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust as a result of the actions carried out by Nazi Germany and its collaborators, and to commemorate the Jewish resistance in that period. In Israel, as shown here, this is a solemn National Memorial Day. Note that juxtaposed to the photos of death camp victims in the slide are some of the reactions on past Holocaust Remembrance Days. It's important to note that it was not only Jews who suffered at the hands of the Nazis. As Simon Wiesenthal, Holocaust survivor, Nazi hunter, and writer stated, The Holocaust was not only a Jewish tragedy, it was a human tragedy. The Holocaust affected my own family. We have records of what happened in my father's village. I'll read an excerpt from a letter from my father's older brother, reproduced in part at the far right. While going through the many papers which my mother, blessed memory, had left after her death, I found a copy of a letter in which recounts, from the words of a survivor, the destruction of the 3,000 Jews of Szczecin, Poland, the village of my father's family, in a series of massacres during June and July 1941. The women were raped, all were robbed and then murdered. In one of the paragraphs, the letter tells, they drove the men into a small building. Each was called out individually and commanded to take off his clothes and shoes. Then most brutally murdered. Among them were Panush, my grandfather's brother, with his son. The tales were later given by the murderers themselves as they boasted of their deeds. Survivors of these pogroms were ultimately transported to the death camp at Auschwitz as part of the genocidal final solution to the Jews, the euphemism for mass annihilation of Hitler, Goering, Himmler, Eichmann, and others. All that remains of that community is a memorial on the site of the desecrated Jewish cemetery. The gravestones haven't been used as streets. Some years ago, I was an invited guest speaker at the Polish Rheumatology Congress held that year in the nearby city of Białystok and went with my father. We had an opportunity to go to Szczecin, where my father was born in the boy was 17, where we recited the traditional memorial prayer for those who perished in these and related events. The Holocaust destroyed Eastern European Jewry. A people with centuries of unique tradition and culture were to be no more. No longer does the sun rise over small villages in Poland or elsewhere in Eastern Europe to meet an elderly Jew reciting a chapter of Psalms or entering a synagogue. Serendipity, or maybe fate, led me to become personally involved in certain issues of Nazi medicine, Nazi positions, and Nazi eponyms. I'd like to relate parts of that story, my own experience encountering something in medicine that troubled me profoundly, how I confronted it in my quest for a measure of justice, and then consider physician responsibilities to society and to social injustice. It's a story I think deserves relating on a day like today, and I hope it's of interest. It's one I've been presented in quite this way of context before until in part at the division conference in January, something I've wanted to do and perhaps write about. It's about an egregious, extraordinary, perhaps unparalleled injustice and moral depravity, which was met largely by silence. Silence. I think that among the lessons from this are that professional silence in the face of social injustice is not only wrong, but pernicious, and that it is possible to bring about change. Several German physicians, previously regarded with honor and respect, now have disgraced reputations because of their activities during the years of the Nazi Third Reich. My comments today will largely focus on Edward Bernkopf, Hans Reiter, and Friedrich Fedner. The story begins with this essay in the Annals of Internal Medicine in 1995 by Edzard Ernst. Ernst, who was not Jewish, was born in Austria after World War II, emigrated to England and became a prominent physiatrist, a leading international authority in complementary and alternative medicine, which is how some years later I actually came to know him and collaborate with him. He recounted the events at the once renowned medical faculty of Vienna following Hitler's annexation of Austria in 1938. These were chilling. Edward Bernkopf, author of an illustrative anatomy atlas, was installed as dean. His atlas in part used Nazi victims as subjects of the drawings. Data supporting this were overwhelming, and certain editions of the atlas were clearly visible swastikas and other Nazi symbols on the illustrations. Bernkopf's response to Hitler's ascendancy, known from his public journal publications, was a gale of rapture. Bernkopf introduced mandatory courses on so-called racial hygiene, demanded loyalty oaths to Hitler, dismissed 78% of his 197 faculty, many or most of whom were Jewish. Those who couldn't emigrate likely perished. He was ultimately responsible for the so-called experiments carried out by his new faculty at Dachau, forcing victims to drink seawater and exposing others to hypothermia. I later learned that two colleagues and friends also wrote of this. Jerry Weissman, who died a couple of years ago, a brilliant rheumatologist and chief of rheumatology at NYU, former president of our American College of Rheumatology, recipient of our highest honor, the Presidential Gold Medal, editor of the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology Journal, born in Vienna in 1930, and whose father was a physician there, also published on this. Some of you will know of Jerry's son, Andrew Weissman, the lead prosecutor in the Mueller investigation. And Peter Scher, at Brigham and Women's, a former arthritis and rheumatology editor and the up-to-date rheumatology editor, whose father, Max, was Sigmund Freud's personal physician, and in whose lab I worked as a fellow, also recently wrote about his family's fleeing Vienna together with the Freud community in those times. I mentioned the Ernst article to a friend, the chief of plastic surgery, the day after reading it, and was surprised that he was familiar with the atlas, as I wasn't, that it was in our library, and that he occasionally used it prior to operations. It stunned me that it was still extant and available. We talked at length about what to do on our customary daily runs together after reading about and speaking with others who had experience and perspective about something like this. How do you deal with such an unexpected and important remnant of Nazism? I needed to look at it, but I could barely bring myself to touch the atlas, knowing how it originated. And not only the book in our library, but those that must be in other libraries. Can you unpublish a book? If so, how? Should you? Discard it, burn it, ban it, change it, stigmatize it, or leave it, as some suggest, in order to remember? We concluded that Holocaust Nazi history, actions, and exploitations of victims were reprehensible, and the atlas irrevocably tainted. We brought this to our medical center leadership and 1,100 plus physician medical staff at St. Barnabas in New Jersey, who agreed not to erase or expunge, but to remove the atlas from circulation and set it aside symbolically in a special display with an historical explanation, after which I discussed this at a grand rounds, and then rewrote of this in a letter to the Annals in response to Ernst's original article. We considered this perhaps a small measure of justice for Holocaust victims 58 years later. You may be interested to know that USC has a copy of the atlas in open circulation, although now with a note. I felt compelled to pursue this, wondering how it was that the atlas could still be published and sold. That led to a long dialogue with Williams and Wilkins, the medical publishers, and their president, trying to persuade the company to cease publication or change how they published the atlas. They didn't, and I decided to protest this in a letter to JAMA, resigning from my editorial positions with journals from the publisher and canceling all my subscriptions to those of their journals that I had. Eventually, publication stopped as demand and profitability for the atlas diminished. I wrote of this both to try and understand what happened when medicine went mad in Nazi Germany, which was the title of a book on the subject, edited by the prominent ethicist Arthur Kaplan, to add my condemnation of the actions of those complicit to the literature, and to make this a matter of record. Perhaps in part because of this, because of other activities and writing about ethical issues in rheumatology, or because I was then chair of the American College of Rheumatology Ethics Committee, a couple of years later, I was asked to review this paper for a journal submitted for publication by colleagues at Cedars-Sinai. Dan Wallace, who like his father was a USC medical school graduate, and Mike Weissman, about the Nazi past of Hans Reiter, which was largely not known. A patient of Michael's informed him of this, and Dan researched the old war and post-war records that documented it rigorously. Reiter was an avid early disciple of Hitler, member of the SS, member of the first group of professionals to swear allegiance to Hitler, a Nazi parliamentary delegate and intimate of Hess, Goebbels, and others, a racist, a vocal proponent of eugenics who denigrated ethnic groups, and was an anti-Semite. He was certainly a major war criminal. He was president of the Reich Health Office, the highest German authority in all fundamental questions of health. He was clearly involved in countless decisions regarding medical ethics and responsible for all the so-called medical experimentation in concentration camps. He was directly and personally involved in pseudo-experiments with typhus at Buchenwald. Although briefly detained after the war, he lied to his interrogators and avoided prosecution, when interest in this by post-war tribunals waned after dealing with more prominent Nazis. He was subsequently honored by the International Red Cross, the Royal Society, and an International Congress on Rheumatism, After his death, he was eulogized effusively in the pages of JAMA by its editor, John Talbot, ironically a noted rheumatologist. This raised the obvious question of whether a war criminal deserved our continued eponymous honor, and if not, how could that be rectified? How do you change the name of the syndrome? Who, if anyone, has authority, responsibility, or prerogatives for this? What now, if anything, would constitute justice for Ryder, his crimes, and his violation and perversion of his moral imperatives as a physician and human being? It seemed to me then that we should repudiate his activities and reputation, rescind the honor of an epidemic syndrome, and rather remember him but an obligate in shame and disgrace. Dan and I and others argued for this. As a board member and ethics chair, I brought to the American College of Rheumatology board meeting the issue of renaming Ryder syndrome and the rationale, and was profoundly disappointed in their response. The majority opinion can be summarized by a board member's comment that this was a political issue, not of their purview, and it wasn't addressed. My colleague and friend, Mike Weinberg of Brigham and Women's, who was then president years later, expressed his regret for this. A year or two later, at the annual meeting of International Rheumatology Editors, of which I was then one, I brought this matter to that group for discussion, after which we agreed that we, the rheumatology editors, indeed medicine, had an ethical responsibility to formally discredit and disavow Hans Ryder, and decided to cease using the term Ryder syndrome and henceforth substitute reactive arthritis as a matter of policy. Slowly it became accepted and the practice throughout the medical literature as it is today. It's important to appreciate that Ryder was not the first to identify the syndrome before his name. It had been described in antiquity and subsequently, and was known in Europe as Fieser-Leroy disease. How it was named is an interesting story, which I learned from Ephraim Engelman after presenting about Ryder to a group of colleagues, among whom was Dr. Engelman. He, one of the first ever rheumatology fellows in the 1930s, then with Walter Bauer, both giants in our field, at the Mass General, was asked to write about that syndrome for the literature and then for the standard rheumatology textbook. Dr. Engelman decided to introduce the eponym for Ryder, who had described it most recently, and it became the general usage. Of note, Dr. Engelman went on to develop the rheumatology program at UCSF, was our national and international president, a presidential gold medalist. He died at age 102 a couple of years ago while working at his UCS office, which was his daily custom. Upon learning how the syndrome acquired its eponym, I suggested to E that he retract his original naming of Ryder syndrome, which, after discussions over some months, he agreed to do, and several of us published this together in our journal. I think this represented a measure of justice for the horrendous actions of Hans Ryder. We couldn't alter what he and others like him did to victims of the Nazis, like those in my family, but perhaps we spoke and acted for them in a sense by calling attention to who Ryder was, holding him accountable for his atrocities in some way, and changing how he is remembered. I hope this was important and that it honors the memories of victims. I do believe those efforts made it easier for subsequent actions of professional societies when Friedrich Wagner's Nazi past was identified by Eric Madison, then the chief at Mayo, and others. Eric and I wrote about this, although my role here was quite minimal. In 2007, the American College of Chest Physicians rescinded a Master Clinician Award previously conferred on Wagner, which I encouraged when their president asked my advice, and most of you know that Wagner syndrome was renamed granulomatosis with polyangiitis, GPA, by the American College of Rheumatology, the European League Against Rheumatism, EULAR, and the American Society of Nephrology in 2011, mostly couched as moving away from using eponyms to more descriptive anatomic and physiologic terms. Nevertheless, I was pleased that my college finally addressed this directly and did what I thought was right, even if not entirely for the reasons I may wish. It's mostly beyond the scope of today's discussion to try and explain what happened in Nazi Germany. When asked, Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who's written and spoken eloquently about this, responded, "How is it possible? How was it possible? I really do not have the answer." This was one of history's greatest tragedies and examples of societal degeneracy and monstrous evil, and it's important to note the profound and pervasive moral failure and silence. pure. I don't dare presume to have better insights than Elie Wiesel about the Holocaust. However, I offer a few brief summary comments about this, and especially the role of physicians, which I think are pertinent, from an extensive literature, some of which is shown here. And I apologize for attempting a great oversimplification of a time and events that historians struggle to understand. Hitler's Germany was considered by many as a unique biocracy, a government with a vision implemented by policies predicated on a distorted, perverted, nationalistic pseudoscience. Killing was conceived as a prerequisite to healing. Supremacy of perceived national needs eclipsed individual rights. There was a historic Germanic Nazi concept of the folk, people with the transcendental essence, embodying myths and cosmos with the revolutionary immortality. The Hegelian utilitarian philosophy of what's useful is right. Subservience of all to an authoritarian state, license to act on the most base and primitive feelings. These all coalesced under the charismatic leadership of Hitler and the distorted pseudoscientific notions of German biomedical science, racial inequality, and Aryan supremacy, offering a vision of redemption, revitalization, and restoration of German glory at the expense of victims. Hitler declared there was no God, no other God but Germany, and he, of course, represented Germany and was its God. He portrayed himself and was perceived by his subjects as doctor of the German people. He prescribed what his perverse mind conceived as necessary for his sick nation to recover and restore its health. It was Voltaire who said that whoever can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Under the doctor's microscope were the causes of the nation's disease, the germs of its infection. Look closely and you can see this shown by the symbols for Jews, the Star of David, for communists and homosexuals, triangles, alongside the British pound and the American dollar. This poem speaks of the Jews' poison, how Hitler attempted to remove his perceived poison, to eliminate his perceived germs, to disinfect and purify Nazi Germany, is now tragic history, remembered on this day. That atrocity would not have been possible without physician complicity. While there was some resistance, medicine as a profession under the Nazis failed spectacularly and grievously here. This is meticulously documented in the references cited, which are very difficult, disturbing, and painful reading. German physicians embraced their Nazi philosophy, were imbued with their historical, cultural, mythical, utilitarian, authoritarian, and nationalistic heritage, accepted the supremacy of national policy, the Nazi vision, and the state biocracy, sacrificed individual rights and their responsibilities to patients for a perceived greater good. They exploited the economic and professional opportunities offered them by the Nazis, clearly at the expense of others. It was doctors who performed the selections. Doctors presided over murders of camp victims. Doctors supervised the killing in the gas chambers. Doctors decided when victims were dead. Doctors carried out murderous epidemiology and barbarous so-called experimentation. Doctors ordered and supervised or carried out direct killing of debilitated patients, kept up a pretense of medical legitimacy. Doctors consulted actively on efficient operations, slave labor selections, and how to burn bodies. What happened when the Nazis occupied the Netherlands is noteworthy, indeed remarkable. Hitler told the Dutch physicians they were to follow these new practices that German physicians had adopted and embraced. Dutch physicians refused, despite threats and without consequences. A few words about the Nazi so-called medical experiments. They were not medical, they were not experiments, but bestial, torturous abominations. Some are listed here and are too upsetting to recount, and they're hideous and outrageous to contemplate. Examples include attempting to homograph limbs from living, unanesthetized donors to recipients, which of course failed. Forcing victims to drink seawater, of course they either went mad or died. Infecting individuals with pathogens, of course they all suffered and most died. These were among those approved and supervised by Hans Reiter, as documented in the war and post-war records. These happened because physicians like Reiter, Wagner, Fernkoff, and others like them allowed this to happen. These have been widely condemned by scientists and medical ethicists as scientifically worthless, morally repugnant, and most agreed they should neither be published nor cited, as summarized by Marcia Angel in the New England Journal. She later served as interim editor-in-chief. Here are some of the comments about these by survivors. This world is not this world. The doctor is not living in a moral situation where limits are very clear is very dangerous. I have no words. I thought we were human beings. We were living creatures. How could they do things like that? Anything is permitted. There was a removal of medical limits. These were the doctors from hell. This is the legacy of physicians like Ryder, Wagner, Perkoff, and others like them. This is how they should be remembered, the doctors from hell. There were revolts by victims in Italy's Third Reich, albeit ultimately futile. The most singular occurred in April 1943, when the remnants of the Warsaw Ghetto, Europe's largest, as many as 460,000 Jews, forced into 1.3 square miles, allocated 300 calories daily by the Nazis, rebelled. Amazingly, this rabble, without a decent weapon, held at bay the mightiest military power the world had ever known up to that time, including elite troops, artillery, armored vehicles, tanks, flamethrowers, and aircraft, for 42 days and 42 nights. It did not seem possible for many nations fell before the German onslaught in but ours. Indeed, all of Poland was able to hold for less than a month. And there were heroes and rescuers who must be acknowledged and remembered. One was Father Bruno Renders from Belgium, shown here as some of the 400 he saved, dear children. When asked why he risked his life to save Jewish children during the war, he responded because they were human beings in peril, and it was our duty to save their lives. There were others, like the Polish families, who hid, sheltered, and saved the life of my lifelong friend and best man at my wedding, Andy Griffel, shown here, and his parents. Andy was born in the attic of his grandfather's leather factory in Rheumatic, Poland, which had been taken over by the Nazis, who were supervising the 200 plus Polish workers there. Two of those workers smuggled his pregnant mother from the ghetto into the attic of the factory and then back, while a Polish doctor and midwife from the neighboring Polish village were brought in to assist with the delivery, while Nazis were on the floor below. Jan Szczepanski, a chemical engineer in the factory, then smuggled Andy to Jan's home, where my friend was raised by Jan and his wife, my friend's Polish mother and father with their daughter until after the war. Meanwhile, his parents were hidden in Warsaw by Hitler Spruce. Remarkably and heroically, none of the many Polish workers in the factory, nor villagers, all aware of these events, all under Nazi scrutiny, betrayed them. Why instead did they risk their lives by protecting these Jews and the baby during that ordeal? Because it was the right thing to do, said the rescuers. It was a miracle, my friend was told by one of the aging workers who recalled their story with clarity when Andy revisited his birthplace some years ago. The family was reunited after the war in the United States. When I talked to Andy about this recently, to be sure I had his permission to relate these events, he insisted I explicitly name those who rescued him and his parents. That something like this was possible amidst all the surrounding catastrophe and horror, while 3 million Jews in Poland alone were being slaughtered, was extraordinary, maybe salutary, maybe hopeful. As I suggested earlier, my generation was born during the Holocaust and grew up in its immediate aftermath. Most Jews were affected in some way. It wasn't history or an abstraction. It was real and it was personal. Before leaving this part of the presentation, I want to mention how this might affect us directly here at Keck and USC. Relatively recently, Dan Wallace, whom I have mentioned, a proud USC medical school graduate, wrote a nice and respectful piece in the Rheumatologist, one of our journals, in 2012, in which he lauded 3 giants at USC for their seminal contributions to immunology, who had important influences on him. Ed Du Bois for his work on lupus, whose practice Dan later joined, George Friot for his early studies of the ANA, and who was USC's first rheumatology division chief, and Sam Rappaport, the classmate of Dan's father, Leon, for his formative investigation of the lupus anticoagulant, together with Don Feinstein. Dan went on to write about the medical school's racial and ethnic focus during his father's time, as well as the hazing, pranks, insults, and anti-Semitism that his father and his 2 Jewish classmates experienced, while Paul McKibben, remembered by the building on campus named in his honor, is dean. Billy Stoll has made the dean's office and the office of President Ford aware of this, and it will be of interest to see what happens. It's been said that the Holocaust does not exist to teach us lessons, yet I and others think there are messages for physicians today as we reflect on societal injustices. I'll put quotes around lessons. Edmund Burke told us the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Edmund Pellegrino, a noted medical ethicist from Georgetown, reminded us that medicine is fundamentally a moral profession. Nuremberg trial jurists have stated that acquiescence in or even silence before the violation of sacred professional ethics, the service of medical men of any goal but the truth for the good of humanity, can lead to dishonor and crime. And from the editorial in the Annals, which accompanied Ernst's essay about the Nazi Anschluss, why revisit these events years later? Because the medical profession must be ever alert to challenges the integrity of its ethics. The Hippocratic Oath has lost none of its relevance. I will use my power to help the sick and to the best of my ability and judgment. I will abstain from harming or wronging any man by it. It's appropriate that the penultimate words about the Holocaust here be from Elie Wiesel. If we forget, we are accomplices, which makes today's discussion timely, perhaps necessary. Silence in the face of injustice is wrong and pernicious. That is the message in this poem by Pastor Niemöller, featured at the United States Holocaust Memorial and the Holocaust Memorial of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and often read on Holocaust Remembrance Day. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me. There was no one left to speak for me. There was but silence. Here, I think, as we begin to conclude, an interesting and compelling perspective about physicians' responsibility for social injustice. Some years ago, when I chaired the Department of Medicine at St. Barnabas, I invited Dr. Patch Adams, played by Robin Williams in the 1998 movie, which was nominated for an Academy Award, to be a visiting professor, which was fun. If you haven't seen the movie or haven't seen it for a while, I recommend it. Patch wasn't the clown Robin Williams portrayed in the movie, but an aging, brainy, passionate, lifelong social activist. Some of what he formerly presented at Grand Rounds as perspective to thinking about physicians and social justice. Patch reminded us that it's still an extraordinary honor and privilege to be a physician, all the perceived exigencies notwithstanding. Few people in the world have the education, stature, and income that we do, with the opportunities to serve and care for others. We're not the ones at the other end of the stethoscope, homeless or with family members killed in natural disasters or without health insurance. All Patch or anyone you said should really need is friends, food, and a place to sleep. We sometimes lose perspective. We are the only profession expected to subordinate our interests to those of our patients. We have the opportunity, and Patch and many believe the responsibility, to strive to do good beyond our caring for our individual patients. Another physician leader who strongly advocated physician responsibility for social injustice is Don Berwick. He wrote a powerful essay in Journal last summer about the moral determinants of health, in which he identified certain current medical and societal problems and argued that we as physicians should participate in addressing them, that this is a moral responsibility, indeed imperative. Some of the residents and perhaps faculty will recall reading selections of his pieces at some of my resident conferences and morning reports. Berwick is the grandchild of immigrants and the son of a GP. He went to Harvard College and Medical School, trained in pediatrics at Boston Children's, remained on the Harvard faculty, and founded the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, the IHI, which became an important instrument for change in healthcare worldwide. Berwick was Obama's recess appointment to direct CMS, serving 18 months that the Senate would never have confirmed him. He returned to Boston and ran in the 2014 Democratic gubernatorial primary, winning a respectable 21% of the vote. Nate Lind, one of our fellows and a former USC resident, worked on his campaign, but Berwick needed more like me. He's now back at Harvard in the IHI. He was our guest here the year before last for Visions and Voices, where I had a chance to meet him and speak with him briefly, which I very much enjoyed. Here he wrote, very relevant to injustice of healthcare inequities, which I presented earlier, improving the social determinants of health will be brought at last to a boil only by the heat of the moral determinants of health. Change requiring transformative reallocation of dollars hasn't happened and is unlikely without change in moral perspective, acknowledgement that all legitimately deserve basic circumstances for healthy lives, and addressing current toxic social circumstances, which he lists, including including statutory recognition of healthcare as a human right here, restoring order, dignity, and equity to democratic institutions, and restoring respect for science. Individuals can speak out right, volunteer, and vote. Organizations can and should act here too. Berwick's most recent piece echoes, encapsulates, and summarizes some of today's themes more eloquently than I could. The work of a physician as healer cannot stop at the door of an office, the threshold of an operating room, at the front gate of a hospital. The rescue of a society and the restoration of a political ethos that remembers to heal have become the physician's jobs too. Professional silence in the face of social injustice is wrong. Professional silence in the face of social injustice is wrong. It's chilling to see the great institutions of healthcare, hospitals, physician groups, scientific bodies assume that the seat of bystander is available, that seat is gone. To try to avoid the political fray through silence is impossible, because silence is now political. Either engage or resist the harm. There is no good choice. Here I respectfully suggest that the messages from Holocaust Remembrance Day that pertain to physician responsibilities for social injustice generally and healthcare inequities in particular. As Berwick quoted yet elsewhere, we all have a responsibility, personal and professional, to address injustice. The Talmud, and I think most faiths, posit that we try to make the world a better place, and Edmund Burke exhorts us to not do nothing. I hope that at least some of what I presented today contribute to not being silent about injustice. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Panush, for that very compelling presentation. In the time that we have still present here, is there anyone with any questions? Please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. Any questions? All right, another comment. Are there any final comments from Dr. Stoll? Would you like to make any comments? Reset that. Go ahead, try again, Dr. Stoll. Something seems to be wrong with your mic, Dr. Stoll. Could you shut it off and come back on? Sorry, it's not coming through well. There's some static on your end. Okay, well, fine. I do have a question here from Dr. Marks. Can you draw, Dr. Panush, can you draw similarities between the removal of Pernkopf book from circulation and removal of Civil War statues?
I could see that being done. That's not the context in which I think about Pernkopf. But issues, they're somewhat similar kinds of issues, if you will. The question before us was, what do you do with the remnants of something that was abhorrent? To destroy it would be doing the same thing that the Nazis did. We thought most people think that's wrong. The question is, how do you preserve it in a way that's meaningful? And perhaps one could have the same conversation about the Civil War monuments. Is destroying them the right? It's not something I've thought a whole lot about, but I know others have. Is destroying them and tearing them down the best way to remember the lessons that one would like to learn from the conflict? Perhaps they could be preserved in some way that's more constructive than simply destroying them. No, right. we didn't argue for expunging all of this from our collective memory. It's important that it be there, but in a context.
Right, I do think the more important thing is the context with which these remnants are remembered. So very good point. Does anyone else have any other questions? Oh, here's a good one. I was on the board when. So someone is commenting about your work not going unnoticed. So I'll read it out loud since that's not available for everyone to see.
That's Dr. Medicine, who was the chief of rheumatology at Mayo. And it was his work, he and his colleagues, who researched and identified the Nazi past of Friedrich Wegner.
And Dr. Madison, you know, I'm going to allow you to go ahead and talk, and so you can go ahead and say your comments. So you can go ahead and unmute yourself and speak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Satra and Dr. Panush. I just wanted to thank Dr. Panush for his moving treatment of physician role and responsibilities in addressing social justice. Without justice, there cannot be health. And this presentation is a very good review of how that historically is true up to the present day in our present situation. I just mentioned that a couple of years after Dr. Panush made this presentation to the board of the American College of Rheumatology to change and not use the term writer syndrome, that I was on the board, and we voted, in fact, to take away the honorary membership that writer had in the American College of Rheumatology and to endorse ceasing the use of that term. And I credit Dr. Panush for initiating this.
Well, thank you for that commentary. Are there any other questions or comments from the audience? Okay, I have one here. What responsibility does the medical profession have to directly address inequalities in healthcare without being viewed as favoring one political party over another?
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. Most
Is there a responsibility? So I mean, it almost goes into what Dr. Fauci's been dealing with Trump, etc.
Yeah, no, I think it is our responsibility. My generation was not brought up in medicine with that awareness. I think that was a mistake. Today, for sure, we have that responsibility. Berwick has presented this incredibly eloquently.
Someone else comments that healthcare is not political, and that was emphasized in this lecture. So, are there any other questions anyone wishes to bring up? All right. Well, if there is no further question, I'd like to thank once again Dr. Panush for giving us this very compelling lecture and presentation and for enlightening us on this historical perspective. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a great day.